It wasn't just a war order. It was permission to kill an idea. In 1941, Hitler signed a document that turned soldiers into executioners and ideology into law. The Commissar order didn't just shape the Eastern Front, it redefined what it meant to obey and what it meant to be human. In the summer of 1941, as German forces prepared to invade the Soviet Union, Adolf Hitler and his senior command drafted one of the most controversial orders in modern military history. Known as the Commissar Befehl, the Commissar Order, it was issued on June 6, 1941, less than 3 weeks before the launch of Operation Barbarossa. Its directive was brutally simple. Political commissars attached to Soviet military units were to be identified and executed immediately upon capture. The order marked a deliberate abandonment of the laws of war, transforming the invasion of the USSR from a military campaign into an ideological crusade. It reflected not only Hitler's strategic vision, but the deep ideological hatred that framed the coming conflict as a war of annihilation between competing worldviews. To understand how the Commissar Order came into being, it is necessary to examine the intellectual climate of Nazi Germany in the late 1930s and early 1940s. The Wehrmacht's preparations for Operation Barbarossa were infused with racial and political propaganda that portrayed the Soviet Union as both racially inferior and ideologically hostile. The Wehrmacht Führungsstab, the Army High Command, was presented with political briefings emphasizing Bolshevism as a Jewish conspiracy designed to destroy civilization. The enemy was not merely the Red Army, but the entire ideological foundation of the Soviet state. Within this framework, the Commissar, an official responsible for political education and morale in Soviet units, was cast as the embodiment of this threat. Killing commissars was thus framed as an act of ideological necessity rather than a war crime. The Wehrmacht's complicity in implementing such directives was not accidental. By 1941, the distinction between the German army and the Nazi regime had eroded significantly. Senior officers including Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Jodl, and Walter Worlimont collaborated closely with the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, in drafting the legal and administrative justifications for the coming campaign. They argued that traditional military law was inapplicable in a war against Bolshevism. In the words of General Erich von Manstein, later recorded in his memoirs, the campaign was to be conducted with unprecedented severity. The Commissar Order was the practical expression of this logic. To defeat an ideological enemy, mercy itself was deemed treasonous. Within the Nazi hierarchy, the idea of eliminating political commissars originated from the highest levels. As early as March 1941, Hitler had told his generals that the coming war would be a clash of two opposing worldviews that could not be resolved through conventional warfare. During a meeting with senior officers on March 30th, he declared that the struggle must be conducted with unprecedented, unmerciful, and unrelenting harshness. The officers present, including Halder and Brauchitsch, took detailed notes, later incorporating these sentiments into operational planning. When the written order was distributed in June, it left little room for ambiguity. It instructed German troops to treat captured commissars not as prisoners of war, but as agitators who must be removed. The wording of the order was deliberately vague, allowing local commanders significant discretion in its application. This ambiguity ensured that the killings would be widespread, yet difficult to trace to specific instructions. The text described commissars as enforcers of the Jewish Bolshevist ideology and warned that their survival could undermine German discipline and morale. The implication was clear. Eliminating them was both a preventive measure and a moral duty. Even officers who expressed discomfort were reminded of their responsibility to maintain the purity of the mission. The order was presented not as an aberration, but as a logical extension of Germany's ideological and racial objectives. At the same time, the order served a political purpose within the Wehrmacht itself. By making obedience to such directives a test of loyalty, the Nazi regime bound the army more tightly to its ideological agenda. The Commissar order acted as a psychological threshold. Once crossed, the Wehrmacht would be fully implicated in the regime's crimes. Some officers protested privately, warning that it violated the Geneva Conventions and could provoke harsh reprisals against German POWs. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock and General Erich Hübner expressed unease, but their objections were dismissed by Keitel as misunderstandings of the Führer's intent. When the order was reaffirmed in writing on June 17, 1941, dissent had effectively been silenced. From the German command's perspective, the Commissar order was not merely an operational measure, but a symbolic act, a declaration that the invasion of the Soviet Union was not a conventional campaign, but a civilizational purge. In this sense, it functioned as part of a larger framework of directives, including the Barbarossa Decree and the guidelines for the conduct of troops in Russia that redefined warfare on the Eastern Front. These documents collectively absolved German soldiers of responsibility for crimes against civilians, partisans, and political officers. They reflected the fusion of ideology and strategy that characterized the Nazi vision of total war. By late June 1941, as German divisions crossed the Bug and Niemen rivers, the consequences of this ideological order began to materialize. In the first weeks of the campaign, field reports indicated that captured commissars were being executed on the spot, often in full view of other prisoners. Units of Army Group North near Białystok and Army Group Center near Minsk recorded multiple liquidations of commissars in their war diaries. In many cases, the killings were carried out not by the SS, but by regular army officers. The act of execution was portrayed as routine, a form of ideological hygiene necessary for maintaining discipline. Thus, even before the German army reached Smolensk or Kiev, the Commissar order had transformed the conduct of the war. It established a precedent for mass executions, blurred the line between combat and extermination, and normalized atrocity within the military structure. More than any single directive, it marked the Wehrmacht's moral descent into complicity with genocide. What had begun as an abstract policy of ideological cleansing would, within months, evolve into a systematic machinery of annihilation, extending far beyond the battlefield. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, the Commissar order immediately changed the moral character of the campaign. For the first time, Wehrmacht units were not simply fighting a hostile army, but carrying out an extermination directive. The order's implementation revealed how ideology had infiltrated every echelon of command. In the first days of the invasion, as German forces advanced across Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, military police units and divisional commanders began identifying captured Soviet commissars. Reports from Army Group Center's 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups recorded dozens of executions within the first week. These killings were not spontaneous acts of brutality. They followed explicit briefings given to officers before the campaign began, during which the ideological purpose of the order was explained in detail. Each unit received copies of the Commissar order marked Geheime Kommandosache, secret command matter, accompanied by verbal clarifications from officers stressing its importance. In some cases, commanders assembled their troops before the offensive to announce that Bolshevist commissars must not be spared. The message was clear. This was a war in which compassion would be treated as weakness. Soldiers who hesitated risked being accused of political unreliability. In certain divisions, such as the 6th and 9th Armies, implementation was swift and systematic. Captured commissars were separated from other prisoners during interrogation and shot immediately after questioning. Reports from the 707th Security Division near Minsk noted that all captured political officers have been liquidated as ordered. The mechanics of execution were as bureaucratic as they were brutal. Commissars were usually identified through their insignia, red stars, armbands, or documentation proving party membership. In cases where such proof was lacking, suspicion alone was often enough. Interrogations were brief and perfunctory. The accused were handed over to Feldgendarmerie or Einsatzgruppen units for summary execution. Eyewitness accounts describe commissars being shot in pits alongside Jews and suspected partisans. This convergence of military and police operations blurred any distinction between battlefield and massacre site. The Commissar order effectively legitimized murder as an extension of command responsibility. Some German officers attempted to interpret the order narrowly to limit its scope. Field Marshal von Rundstedt instructed his subordinates to exercise discretion in identifying commissars, emphasizing that executions should not cause disorder within the ranks. Yet even such limited restraint was the exception rather than the rule. Many officers saw compliance as a demonstration of loyalty to Hitler. The Fourth Army, under General Günther von Kluge, recorded that political officers are being eliminated as planned, while the Ninth Army noted that enemy commissars were treated in accordance with the Führer's directive. These entries appeared in official war diaries, showing that the killings were not hidden, but normalized within military reporting. The ideological language surrounding the order amplified its reach. Propaganda materials distributed to troops described commissars as fanatical instigators, responsible for atrocities against Germans during the First World War and the Russian Civil War. Some officers, particularly in rear area commands, refused to execute commissars, citing concerns about discipline and reprisals. A few attempted to circumvent the order by transferring prisoners to the Einsatzgruppen, effectively delegating responsibility for the killings. Others quietly ignored it altogether, choosing to treat commissars as ordinary POWs. Yet these acts of defiance were rare and often dangerous. The Gestapo monitored correspondence and reports, and those suspected of softness risked investigation. The moral pressure to conform outweighed personal conscience. By late July 1941, the German High Command received increasing reports of the order's successful execution. Hitler's headquarters interpreted this as evidence of ideological loyalty within the army. The killings were discussed not as crimes, but as indicators of morale. A situation report from Heeresgruppe Süd praised its units for having carried out the Führer's instructions with efficiency. In Berlin, these reports were compiled into summaries for Hitler and the OKW, confirming that the army had embraced its role in the war of extermination. The Commissar order, initially conceived as a tool of ideological terror, had succeeded in transforming obedience itself into an act of complicity. Thus, within the first 6 weeks of the invasion, the Commissar order had done more than authorize the murder of thousands. It had redefined the moral framework of the German military. It erased the distinction between lawful warfare and criminal violence, ensuring that the ideological war against Bolshevism was fought as a campaign of annihilation. The Wehrmacht had crossed an irreversible line, one that would tie its fate to the crimes of the regime it served. As the invasion of the Soviet Union expanded through the summer of 1941, the Commissar order's consequences became deeply embedded in the Wehrmacht's operational culture. The order's language, couched in ideological necessity rather than tactical reasoning, allowed commanders to interpret it broadly, resulting in inconsistent but widespread implementation. By August, it was no longer confined to frontline engagements. Security divisions, rear echelon units, and even administrative staffs began applying it to prisoners, civilians, and suspected partisans. The war diary of the 221st Security Division recorded the execution of 40 political functionaries near Smolensk, noting that local peasants assisted in identifying them. In practice, Commissar had become a catch-all term, used to justify the killing of anyone associated with the Soviet state. The Wehrmacht's own reporting structures helped institutionalize the killings. Units were required to submit daily situation reports detailing prisoner numbers, casualties, and special measures. While these reports rarely mentioned commissars by name, references to enemy political officers eliminated or agitators removed became commonplace. Commanders learned how to conceal the reality behind bureaucratic euphemisms. In the 12th Infantry Division, for example, a July report listed 42 political prisoners liquidated under maintenance of order in occupied territories. Such language sanitized violence, transforming murder into administration. It also insulated the chain of command from direct accountability. allowing field units to frame executions as routine counterintelligence operations rather than violations of international law. The enforcement of the Commissar order also intersected with the activities of the Einsatzgruppen, the SS mobile killing units operating behind the front lines. Coordination between the Wehrmacht and these units was often seamless. In Army Group North Sector, SS Brigade Führer Franz Walter Stahlecker's Einsatzgruppe A worked closely with the 16th Army to identify and execute commissars, party members, and Jews. Field records indicate that Wehrmacht military police frequently delivered captured commissars directly to the SS, fully aware of their fate. In some cases, cooperation was formalized. In the Army Group Center area, a July 1941 agreement stipulated that captured commissars are to be handed over to the security police for special treatment. This division of labor blurred the distinction between military and police authority, embedding ideological extermination into the Army's logistical operations. The ideological conditioning of soldiers played a critical role in ensuring compliance. Before the invasion, the Propagandaamt der Wehrmacht distributed millions of leaflets, news bulletins, and lectures emphasizing the moral necessity of destroying Bolshevism. Troops were told that the Soviet enemy represented an existential danger to Europe's civilization. The Commissar was depicted as both subhuman and demonic, a figure of ideological corruption rather than a legitimate adversary. Within weeks of combat, these messages took root. Letters intercepted by censors from soldiers at the front frequently referred to commissars as animals or poison. One private from the 10th Panzer Division wrote home that his unit had done its duty by removing several red beasts, a phrase that mirrored official propaganda almost verbatim. Nevertheless, the practical application of the order varied depending on unit discipline, command attitude, and proximity to SS formations. In some areas, particularly in the north, execution was systematic. The 18th Army, advancing through the Baltic states, executed commissars at nearly every stage of its progress. In other sectors, officers sought to limit the killings. General Gotthard Heinrici of the 43rd Corps, known for his professionalism, instructed his subordinates to avoid unnecessary executions, fearing they would undermine troop morale. His division commanders quietly recorded commissars as regular POWs, effectively circumventing the order. Yet even these limited acts of defiance did not challenge the system itself. They merely displaced responsibility. The order's existence meant that moral boundaries had already been erased. The psychological toll on German soldiers was complex. Many accepted the executions as necessary, a duty demanded by the war's ideological nature. Others experienced quiet unease. Diaries recovered from the front reveal ambivalence rather than open dissent. One lieutenant in the 78th Infantry Division wrote, "It is said the commissars are not men, that they are beyond mercy. But when we shot one today, he saluted before he died." Such entries were rare but revealing. They reflected an undercurrent of doubt that could not be expressed publicly. The Wehrmacht's command culture left no space for moral reflection. To question the legitimacy of the Commissar order was to question the war itself. As German forces advanced deeper into Soviet territory, the Commissar order became entwined with the broader policy of Vernichtungskrieg, the war of annihilation. The line between executing commissars and murdering prisoners of war or civilians blurred rapidly. By September 1941, German POW camps were filled with millions of Red Army soldiers. Under the ideological framework established by the Commissar order, political officers were separated, interrogated, and killed. Prisoners suspected of being commissars, sometimes identified merely by literacy or assertiveness, were shot without trial. Estimates suggest that between 60,000 and 80,000 captured commissars and political officers were executed during the first 6 months of the campaign. These killings were only a fraction of the total deaths among Soviet POWs, of whom 2.8 million perished by the spring of 1942, largely through starvation, exposure, or disease. The order's effects extended far beyond the battlefield. It reinforced a hierarchy of human value that would soon underpin broader genocidal policies. In occupied territories, the logic of ideological extermination spread to civilians. Local officials, teachers, and party activists were executed as commissars in civilian dress. The Einsatzgruppen used this justification to carry out mass shootings of Jews, claiming they were eliminating potential political leaders. In this way, the Commissar order served as both precedent and prototype for later mass murder. It normalized extrajudicial killing, provided bureaucratic cover, and merged racial ideology with military necessity. By autumn 1941, evidence of the order's brutality had reached the highest levels of command. Reports from the front noted excesses and incidents of unnecessary cruelty, but the underlying directive remained intact. Hitler's staff dismissed concerns that the killings might provoke Soviet reprisals or alienate potential collaborators. Keitel and Jodl reiterated that the order was an essential component of the ideological war. To rescind it would be, in their view, to admit weakness. The Wehrmacht's leadership thus made a conscious decision. Obedience to the regime's ideology outweighed military pragmatism. In doing so, they transformed the army from an instrument of conquest into an accomplice in systematic murder. The Commissar order was not merely a tactical directive, it was a declaration of moral inversion. It taught soldiers that killing was not only permitted, but virtuous when directed against the right kind of enemy. By the time winter approached in 1941, the order's impact had already transcended its original purpose. It had rewritten the moral code of the German army and redefined what it meant to obey. By October 1941, as German forces closed in on Moscow, the Commissar order had become an inseparable element of the army's operations and psychology. The directive, originally framed as a measure against political officers, had evolved into a general license for brutality. Executions of commissars continued wherever the Wehrmacht advanced, but now the same ideological justification extended to ordinary prisoners, wounded soldiers, and even civilians suspected of harboring political sympathies. The order's original targets, members of the Soviet political apparatus, had long ceased to be its only victims. Field reports from Army Group Center during the Vyazma and Bryansk encirclements illustrate how deeply the practice had taken root. After the capture of over 650,000 Soviet troops in October, commissars and political officers were systematically separated from the general prisoner population. In a single day, October 10, 1941, the Second Army reported the execution of 190 commissars near Smolensk. Other groups were handed over to SS detachments for special treatment. These operations were conducted with bureaucratic precision, recorded in war diaries as logistical details rather than moral decisions. Phrases such as screening completed or agitators eliminated appeared in daily summaries, giving murder the language of efficiency. The brutal winter of 1941-42 magnified these effects. As German logistics collapsed and frontline units faced shortages of food and shelter, resentment toward prisoners intensified. Captured commissars were now portrayed not merely as ideological enemies, but as obstacles to survival. Accounts from the 31st Infantry Division describe soldiers executing Soviet prisoners during transport marches to reduce rations and prevent outbreaks. Starvation and exhaustion became deliberate tools of attrition. The Commissar order had legitimized killing without trial. Now necessity became its moral extension. In camps such as Dulag 203 near Minsk and Stalag 352 near Molodechno, political officers were executed upon arrival, often by Wehrmacht guards rather than SS personnel. The army no longer required direction from above. The culture of extermination had become self-sustaining. At the same time, isolated instances of resistance persisted within the ranks. General Erich von Manstein, commanding the 11th Army in Ukraine, issued an internal memorandum in November 1941 suggesting that the order be applied with discretion, fearing that indiscriminate executions might damage discipline. Yet his own army's records contradict this caution. Reports from Sevastopol and Simferopol document the execution of commissars in large numbers, frequently alongside Jewish civilians. Manstein's later claims of restraint were part of a broader post-war effort to dissociate the army from Nazi policy. In practice, ideological and racial directives operated in tandem. Wherever the Wehrmacht advanced, mass shootings followed. The order's language also shaped the treatment of Soviet partisans. As resistance movements began forming behind German lines, the Commissar became a symbolic justification for reprisals. Anti-partisan directives often referred to insurgents as Bolshevik political elements, echoing the same terminology. Villages accused of harboring partisans were burned, and inhabitants labeled as Commissar supporters were executed en masse. The ideological structure of the order made collective punishment not only acceptable but expected. Commanders justified atrocities by equating political resistance with subhumanity. In this environment, distinctions between soldier, civilian, and partisan ceased to exist. The moral corrosion spread quickly through the army's hierarchy. Field Marshal von Reichenau's notorious order to his Sixth Army, issued on October 10, 1941, declared that the soldier must understand the necessity of harsh but just retribution against subhuman Bolshevist agitators. His directive, endorsed by Hitler, urged troops to see themselves as avengers of German culture. In effect, it was an ideological reaffirmation of the Commissar order, presented as military doctrine. Commanders who adopted Reichenau's model, such as von Manstein and von Küchler, reinforced the fusion of operational necessity and ideological violence. The line separating regular Army and SS methods disappeared completely. The consequences for Soviet prisoners were catastrophic. By December 1941, approximately 2 million Red Army POWs were in German custody, of whom more than half had already perished. While starvation and exposure accounted for most deaths, the Commissar order ensured that executions remained systematic. Estimates by the German Army High Command itself acknowledged tens of thousands of commissars and political officers removed from the ranks by the end of the year. Surviving Soviet testimonies describe the terror these policies instilled. Commissars traveling with retreating units often destroyed their documents or stripped insignia to avoid identification. Some commanders dispersed political officers among their men or ordered them to fight as regular soldiers in the hope of sparing them. Few survived capture. As reports of atrocities filtered back to Berlin, a muted debate emerged within sections of the Wehrmacht's leadership. The Army's legal office, led by General Karl Sack, raised concerns that the Commissar order violated international law and endangered captured German officers. However, these objections were political gestures rather than genuine opposition. Hitler dismissed all criticism, declaring in December 1941 that the war against Bolshevism is not subject to the Geneva Convention. The order remained in force. In the following months, directives were issued reminding commanders that leniency toward political functionaries is equivalent to treason. Such language ensured that the killings continued with renewed ideological vigor. The Commissar order also deepened cooperation between the Wehrmacht and the SS. As the invasion stagnated in the winter snows, the front lines froze, but the machinery of annihilation continued behind them. Einsatzgruppen units stationed in occupied cities reported that Army commands regularly supplied lists of captured commissars for execution. In territories such as Belarus and Ukraine, local collaborators were recruited to identify political officers, often denouncing neighbors for survival. The scale of violence expanded beyond any initial conception of the order's purpose. What had begun as a policy targeting enemy officers now formed the foundation for a system of mass terror across the occupied East. By the start of 1942, the Commissar order had achieved its ideological goal. It had transformed obedience into complicity and discipline into destruction. The Wehrmacht's officers, once bound by notions of military honor, had become instruments of political murder. Even those who never personally executed a commissar had accepted the normalization of killing as part of their profession. The order's moral contagion infected every level of command, ensuring that even as military fortunes shifted, the culture of ideological extermination would endure. By early 1942, the Commissar order had completed its evolution from a written directive into a pervasive mindset. The brutal winter, which halted the Wehrmacht's advance and exposed the myth of blitzkrieg, only reinforced the ideological justifications behind the order. The hardships of the front, the cold, hunger, and massive casualties, were increasingly explained as the result of Bolshevik resistance, turning the enemy into both the cause and the punishment for German suffering. Propaganda distributed to frontline units revived Hitler's original language. The Commissar is the poison in the Red Army. Where he is found, he must be destroyed without hesitation. In such a climate, the order no longer needed to be explicitly invoked. It had become a reflex. The operational environment of 1942, defined by retreat, partisan warfare, and occupation, magnified the order's impact. The German army now controlled vast areas of the Soviet Union, containing millions of civilians and prisoners. Local administration, already thinly stretched, adopted the logic of ideological extermination as a tool of control. Reports from Army Group South in Ukraine describe political cleansing actions aimed at removing commissars and party officials from occupied towns. In Kharkiv, records show that by February 1942, 247 Bolshevik elements had been executed under the order's authority. These operations were no longer isolated incidents but part of routine governance, blending counterinsurgency with political murder. At the same time, the lines between the Wehrmacht, SS, and civilian occupation authorities grew increasingly blurred. Security divisions and SS police regiments often conducted joint operations under the pretext of rooting out commissars. A report from the 213th Security Division near Orel described cooperation with Einsatzgruppe B in neutralizing political functionaries and Jewish intelligentsia. Such language encapsulated the ideological fusion that defined the occupation. The Commissar order provided the legal and moral precedent for actions that were now indistinguishable from genocide. The extermination of commissars and Jews followed the same logic. Both were portrayed as ideological enemies whose existence threatened the stability of German rule. Within the Wehrmacht's internal communications, unease persisted but never translated into effective opposition. Several senior officers expressed concern that the order was damaging discipline and morale. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge argued that executions carried out in front of troops created confusion about military purpose. Others warned that Soviet retaliation against German prisoners was becoming more likely. But Hitler and the OKW rejected such objections. On March 6, 1942, Keitel reaffirmed the validity of the Commissar order, writing that the fight against Bolshevism is the fight for Germany's future. Those who question the Führer's directive undermine the entire war effort. His language made dissent synonymous with betrayal. The message to the officer corps was clear. To obey was to remain loyal. To hesitate was treason. Even as the Wehrmacht's frontline situation grew more desperate, the ideological war intensified. When the Red Army launched its counteroffensive around Rzhev and the Demyansk pocket in early 1942, captured Soviet officers and commissars were subjected to immediate execution as instruments of the Kremlin. The Ninth Army, under Model's command, reported that political functionaries were eliminated on the spot as per order. The phrase had become a euphemism known and accepted by all ranks. In prisoner of war camps, the policy became even more deadly. At Stalag 352 near Minsk and Stalag 326 near Bielefeld, political officers were systematically starved, beaten, or shot. German guards routinely justified these killings by citing the order, though few could recall its exact wording. The ideological structure was sufficient. The document itself was no longer needed. Meanwhile, the Nazi propaganda apparatus worked to ensure public ignorance in Germany. Official communiques framed the Eastern Front as a battle for civilization against Asiatic barbarism. The Commissar order was never published, but its logic saturated public discourse. Newspapers celebrated frontline justice against Soviet fanatics. Civilians reading Das Reich or listening to Goebbels' broadcasts learned that the Red Army was sustained by criminal commissars who forced men to fight at gunpoint. The murder of political officers thus appeared to be a humanitarian act, liberation from tyranny rather than extermination. The moral inversion was complete. Killing was redefined as protection, violence as virtue. By mid-1942, the cumulative toll of these policies was staggering. German military archives indicate that at least 80,000 Soviet commissars and political officers were executed between June 1941 and July 1942. The number may have been higher, as many killings went unreported or were absorbed into broader categories of security operations. The Red Army, aware of the order's implications, began adapting its structure. In October 1942, the system of dual command, where commissars shared authority with officers, was formally abolished. Political officers were retained but stripped of independent command power. This reform was partly pragmatic, intended to streamline control, but it also reflected a grim adaptation to German policy. If the enemy executed commissars, then commissars could no longer be visible. For Soviet soldiers, the order shaped both fear and defiance. Captured Red Army men often destroyed identifying documents or attempted to disguise themselves as civilians. Some commissars fought to the death rather than risk capture, while others committed suicide when encircled. Soviet propaganda transformed these tragedies into symbols of heroism. Leaflets and speeches celebrated the commissar as a martyr who faced the fascist bullet with a clenched fist. In this way, the German attempt to demoralize the enemy achieved the opposite. The order strengthened Soviet resolve by confirming that surrender was not survival, but death. At the operational level, the Commissar order also affected German command discipline. The normalization of ideological killing undermined military cohesion, creating a moral vacuum that eroded traditional hierarchy. Soldiers accustomed to shooting prisoners became desensitized to violence against civilians, partisans, and even fellow soldiers. Reports from disciplinary battalions in Army Group North mention incidents of looting, sexual assault, and arbitrary executions, crimes rarely punished because they were consistent with the overall atmosphere of lawlessness. The authority of command now rested not on law or honor, but on ideological conformity. By the end of 1942, as the Wehrmacht's momentum stalled at Stalingrad, the Commissar order had achieved its grim objective. It had redefined obedience in ideological terms and ensured that the army's moral boundaries were permanently broken. The Wehrmacht could no longer claim ignorance or distance from the crimes of the regime it served. What had begun as a directive for the front lines had become the moral foundation of a campaign that consumed both its victims and its perpetrators. The winter of 1942-43 marked a critical juncture in both the military and moral trajectory of the Eastern Front. The defeat at Stalingrad shattered the illusion of German invincibility and forced a reckoning, however brief, within the Wehrmacht's ranks. For the first time, whispers of disillusionment began to circulate among officers. Yet the ideological foundations laid by the Commissar order ensured that the capacity for moral reflection was limited. The order had not merely directed behavior, it had reshaped the conceptual boundaries of duty itself. To obey was no longer a matter of military discipline, but of ideological loyalty. Even as the tide of war turned, this framework persisted, continuing to justify the dehumanization of the enemy and the destruction of civilians caught between retreat and pursuit. As Soviet forces pressed westward after the encirclement at Stalingrad, the execution of commissars did not cease. Reports from Army Group South during the retreat across the Don Basin show that prisoners identified as political officers were still being shot on the spot. Field police units in Kharkiv and Belgorod recorded preventive eliminations of enemy agitators, a euphemism that concealed the continuing application of the Commissar order. The difference was that the killings now took place in chaos rather than triumph. The retreat blurred the distinction between execution and panic, between command discipline and vengeance. The Commissar order, once an official directive, had by now become an ingrained reflex within the German army's culture of annihilation. In March 1943, an internal memorandum circulated among certain Wehrmacht legal officers proposed revisiting the policy. General Hans Adolf Pritzmann, then head of anti-partisan operations, argued that the order had fulfilled its purpose and was now politically disadvantageous. His concerns were pragmatic rather than moral. He feared that the brutal treatment of prisoners was motivating increased partisan resistance, but the High Command rejected his recommendation. Hitler, upon reviewing the memorandum, insisted that the ideological dimension of the war must remain uncompromised. He reiterated in a directive dated April 6, 1943, that no mercy can be shown to the bearers of Bolshevik thought. This reaffirmation, though less publicized, effectively revalidated the order at the very moment when its military logic had collapsed. At the front, obedience persisted through habit rather than enthusiasm. Soldiers who had once acted out of ideological conviction now followed the same patterns out of fear, exhaustion, or inertia. Field Marshal von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, issued orders to maintain discipline in the treatment of captured enemy political elements, but stopped short of rescinding the executions. His post-war claim that he had interpreted the order flexibly is contradicted by surviving documents which record hundreds of executions carried out under his authority in Crimea and the lower Dnieper region. The language of flexibility thus became a retrospective defense mechanism, used by many commanders to obscure the extent of their compliance. The Commissar order's moral contagion also influenced the treatment of other perceived enemies. As partisan warfare intensified across occupied Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, the ideological framework of extermination expanded to encompass entire populations. Directives issued by the 201st and 286th Security Divisions in 1943 referred to Bolshevik Commissar influence as justification for collective reprisals against villages suspected of aiding partisans. Entire communities were destroyed under the claim that they were centers of political agitation. Civilians were executed not for resistance but for ideology, an echo of the order's original logic. The war of extermination had become self-perpetuating, detached from both strategy and necessity. At the same time, the Wehrmacht's internal cohesion began to fray under the pressure of continuous retreat. Officers who once enforced ideological discipline now faced rising indifference among the ranks. Diaries from frontline units reveal a shift in tone. Soldiers expressed bitterness toward their own leadership, but not necessarily empathy for their victims. "They say we fight for Europe," one corporal from the 17th Panzer Division wrote in May 1943, "but here there is nothing left alive to save." The line between ideological conviction and nihilism had dissolved. The Commissar order's dehumanizing logic, initially designed to strengthen resolve, now produced moral fatigue. Soldiers who could no longer believe in victory continued to kill because killing had become normal. The SS, meanwhile, expanded its ideological oversight over Wehrmacht operations. Following the creation of the SS and police leadership network in 1943, Heinrich Himmler sought to ensure that the army maintained ideological purity even amid military setbacks. His representatives visited frontline commands to reaffirm the necessity of uncompromising struggle against Bolshevism. In practice, this meant the continuation of the Commissar order's spirit under new administrative labels. Field instructions issued to SS police regiments in occupied Poland and western Ukraine referred to the eradication of political commissars and their sympathizers. The order's vocabulary remained embedded in the bureaucratic DNA of Nazi governance, even as the military situation deteriorated. By the middle of 1943, the Wehrmacht's high command began to lose control over the very forces it had unleashed. The Army's moral disintegration became visible in its treatment of civilians during the retreat following the Battle of Kursk. Units burned villages and executed inhabitants to deny the Red Army shelter, often citing Bolshevik collaboration. These actions were not direct consequences of new orders, but of a cumulative moral collapse initiated 2 years earlier. The Commissar order had introduced a logic in which extermination was synonymous with efficiency, and mercy was equated with disloyalty. Once internalized, such logic could not be undone by changing circumstances. Among the German public, knowledge of these policies remained limited but not absent. Soldiers on leave brought home fragmented stories of executions, and rumors circulated in private correspondence. The regime countered these with intensified propaganda, emphasizing the fanaticism of the Soviet enemy and framing the campaign as a defensive war for survival. This narrative allowed the Commissar Order's ideology to persist indirectly, even as the document itself faded from operational relevance. It continued to justify suffering and brutality, both at the front and at home. In the occupied territories, the Order's shadow lingered longest. As the Red Army began its counteroffensive in late 1943, retreating German forces conducted cleansing operations designed to eliminate anyone who could aid the Commissars. These last executions were less about ideology than about fear. Fear of accountability, retribution, and defeat. Yet the distinction no longer mattered. The Order had succeeded in its ultimate aim. It had turned the German army into an instrument of ideological extermination. Even as it withdrew across the same ground it had once conquered, the Wehrmacht carried with it the moral legacy of the Commissar Order, a doctrine that made killing synonymous with obedience and destruction indistinguishable from duty. By early 1944, the Red Army's relentless advance forced the Wehrmacht into a state of continuous retreat, and yet the shadow of the Commissar Order continued to shape its behavior. Although no longer formally emphasized in operational directives, the ideology behind it had become so deeply ingrained that it required no written reminder. The Order's essence, that the political enemy must be annihilated without trial, had merged with the Army's instinct for survival. Even as units fell back across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, executions of captured political officers, partisans, and civilians suspected of communist ties persisted under the guise of security operations. The moral infrastructure of the Order endured long after the paper had disappeared. Field reports from the 9th and 4th Armies during the retreat from Belarus in the spring of 1944 documented dozens of cases of liquidation of Bolshevik leaders, a phrase that had become shorthand for the continued application of the Commissar Order. In one recorded incident near Mogilev, 33 prisoners, including Red Army officers and suspected party members, were executed following summary identification by German security police. Similar events unfolded across the collapsing front. The Wehrmacht, now fighting a defensive war on scorched ground, justified its actions as preventive measures against the return of Commissar terror. Even in defeat, the ideology of annihilation sustained its own momentum, transforming battlefield failure into a moral crusade. The Army's retreat exposed the full consequences of 3 years of ideological warfare. In areas where German occupation collapsed, the local population was left in ruins. Entire villages were burned to eliminate political agitators. The 286th Security Division reported in April 1944 that enemy influence in rural communities has been eliminated, a euphemism concealing the execution of hundreds of civilians in western Ukraine. The logic of the Commissar Order, once aimed at captured officers, now encompassed entire populations. Civilians were not merely collateral victims, they were political targets. Every partisan, teacher, or village elder could be branded a commissar. Among German officers, awareness of impending defeat began to alter the tone of compliance. Some commanders sought to destroy evidence of executions or distance their units from documented atrocities. War diaries were edited, reports rewritten, and euphemisms multiplied. Security measures, political cleansing, and anti-partisan actions replaced direct references to shootings. Nevertheless, the ideological foundations remained intact. When questioned by subordinates about the continuing executions, officers often replied, "The Führer's order still stands." This phrase, repeated like a catechism, revealed the psychological endurance of obedience. The Commissar Order had transformed from a written instruction into a moral reflex, unquestionable, eternal, and detached from practical necessity. The transformation of the Order's application also mirrored the broader disintegration of the German command structure. As the Red Army approached Poland and the Baltic coast, Wehrmacht units were increasingly absorbed into SS-led defensive operations. In these combined formations, the line between military and ideological violence disappeared entirely. SS officers invoked the Commissar order's principles to justify summary executions of prisoners, deserters, and even German soldiers accused of defeatism. The logic of ideological purity that once targeted enemy commissars now turned inward. As morale collapsed, the army began consuming itself. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence was well aware of the order's continuing impact. Recovered documents and testimonies from liberated territories provided overwhelming evidence of mass executions carried out in accordance with the directive. The Soviet Information Bureau published excerpts of captured German reports describing the screening and liquidation of political officers. Propaganda posters across the front proclaimed, "No commissar captured alive, such is the fascist law." These messages were designed not only to inflame anger, but to reinforce resistance. For Red Army soldiers, the Commissar order remained a psychological weapon. Knowing that surrender meant certain death, they fought harder, often to the last man. What the Germans intended as a tool of fear had instead produced defiance. In the German homeland, the Commissar order remained largely unknown to the general population. Wartime censorship ensured that its existence was never publicly acknowledged. Families receiving letters from the front heard of heavy fighting, fanatical resistance, or cleansing operations, but not of mass executions. Only within the higher echelons of the army and government was the full scope of the policy understood. Even there, silence prevailed. Hitler's insistence on ideological unity suppressed dissent, and officers who questioned the policy risked being denounced as politically unreliable. The psychological trap was complete. To oppose the order was to oppose the war itself. By the summer of 1944, as the Wehrmacht reeled from the catastrophic losses of Operation Bagration, the remnants of the Commissar order merged with the desperation of total war. Retreating units engaged in scorched earth tactics, destroying infrastructure and killing civilians accused of aiding the Soviets. Reports from Army Group North detail the execution of agitators and saboteurs in Estonia and Latvia, coded phrases that masked the killing of local communists and captured Red Army officers. In effect, the Commissar order had outlived its own legality. It survived as ideology rather than policy. Its moral justification, the belief that annihilation was defense, persisted even when there was nothing left to defend. In the eyes of those who issued and obeyed it, the order had become synonymous with loyalty. To question it was to question the regime's entire worldview. By 1944, this logic had stripped the Wehrmacht of the capacity for moral distinction. The destruction of commissars, partisans, and civilians was no longer seen as separate from the destruction of enemy armies. All were part of the same total war. As German forces withdrew westward, the physical battlefield contracted, but the moral battlefield expanded, reaching from the ruins of Smolensk to the heart of Germany itself. The Commissar order had begun as an instruction for the front. It ended as the psychological blueprint for a nation preparing to fight to extinction. For the men who carried out its directives, the collapse of the Eastern Front revealed a final paradox. The order that had promised to protect the German army from Bolshevik vengeance now ensured that no mercy could be expected in return. As Soviet forces advanced into the Reich's eastern territories, the fear of retribution transformed into fatalism. Many officers understood that they would be judged not for military failure, but for ideological complicity. Yet the habits of obedience remained unbroken. Even in the ruins of East Prussia, reports continued to reference cleansing actions and preventive eliminations. The words had outlasted their purpose. The order, once meant to serve victory, had instead defined the moral terms of defeat. By 1945, the ideological poison unleashed by the Commissar order had reached its logical conclusion. The Wehrmacht, once presented as a disciplined professional army, had become an instrument of annihilation, indistinguishable from the SS it once sought to distance itself from. The order's language, rooted in the dehumanization of political enemies, had by now expanded to encompass every opponent of the Reich. The Commissar was no longer a specific role within the Red Army. It had become a symbol of the enemy itself, the partisan, the civilian, the deserter, even the German soldier who hesitated to obey. As Soviet troops crossed into East Prussia in January 1945, fear and retribution swept through German ranks. Propaganda recycled the same ideological framework that had justified the Commissar order 4 years earlier. Soldiers were told that Bolshevik beasts would inflict merciless revenge, and therefore mercy toward them was treason. In desperation, commanders reissued security directives, authorizing executions of anyone suspected of cooperation with the advancing enemy. Reports from Army Group Vistula mention the summary execution of captured Soviet officers and local civilians accused of signaling to the Red Army. The violence was no longer organized, but instinctual, ideology fused with panic. In East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, rear units and remnants of security divisions carried out mass killings in the chaos of withdrawal. Prisoners, wounded soldiers, and political detainees were executed to prevent their fall into Bolshevik hands. The Commissar order's rationale, preventing ideological contamination, was invoked to justify these last acts of cruelty. In Königsberg, records show that in February 1945, over 400 Soviet POWs were shot under the pretext of preventing an uprising. In Gdansk and Elbląg, local party officials ordered executions of suspected agents as the front collapsed. The order's essence, obedience through extermination, remained the default moral compass of a regime in its death throes. The Red Army's discovery of German atrocities further reinforced the ideological divide. Soviet reports from liberated camps near Smolensk, Minsk, and Rzeszów documented systematic killings of commissars and prisoners. The findings were used during the Nuremberg preparations, where captured German documents and testimonies confirmed the Commissar order's implementation at every level of command. The evidence was damning. Field reports, diaries, and intercepted communications showed that the directive had been neither isolated nor misunderstood. It had been executed precisely as intended. Inside the Wehrmacht's hierarchy, attempts to erase the documentary trail accelerated. Staff officers burned archives, destroyed logs, and replaced incriminating reports with sanitized summaries. Some divisions, anticipating post-war prosecution, falsified casualty figures, or reclassified executions as combat losses. Despite these efforts, the structural pattern of extermination was too pervasive to conceal. The Commissar order had left its imprint on nearly every operational report, every security action, every rear area patrol. It was the invisible thread connecting the Army's atrocities across millions of square kilometers of occupied territory. When the war ended in May 1945, the survivors of the German High Command faced the reckoning they had long postponed. During interrogation, many sought to downplay their involvement. Wilhelm Keitel insisted the order was a temporary measure, issued in the heat of battle. Alfred Jodl claimed it was poorly interpreted by lower officers. Field marshals like Manstein and Rundstedt distanced themselves from its enforcement, portraying it as an SS initiative. But the captured documents contradicted them. Transcripts from Army Group reports, signed by their own hands, showed that they had not only known about the executions, but had rationalized them as necessary to the war effort. At the Nuremberg trials, the Commissar order became one of the central exhibits of the prosecution. It represented the moment when the German military consciously merged legality with murder, turning ideology into command policy. The tribunal rejected every claim of ignorance or coercion. The judges noted that the order's language left no room for ambiguity, and that its execution constituted a deliberate violation of the laws and customs of war. For the first time in modern history, obedience itself was placed on trial. The defense of just following orders was dismantled, revealing that the moral burden of obedience could not absolve individual responsibility. For the Soviet Union, the Commissar order became a cornerstone of post-war memory. It was cited as proof of German barbarism and used to justify both retribution and political consolidation. Soviet propaganda immortalized commissars as martyrs of ideological purity, their deaths woven into the narrative of collective heroism. In literature, film, and education, the order symbolized the moral difference between fascism and socialism, cruelty and sacrifice. Yet beneath the triumphal narrative lay a deeper scar, the recognition that millions had died because ideology had replaced humanity on both sides of the front. In post-war Germany, the order's legacy was contested. During the 1950s and 1960s, former Wehrmacht officers who joined the Bundeswehr or wrote memoirs minimized the order's impact, portraying it as an aberration or an SS imposition. It was not until the 1980s, with the work of historians like Wolfram Wethe and Omer Bartov, that the full extent of the Wehrmacht's complicity was confronted. The revelation that ordinary soldiers, not just fanatical ideologues, had participated in the killings shattered the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. The Commissar order became the symbol of that myth's collapse, the proof that professional soldiers had knowingly committed crimes in the name of obedience. The moral questions raised by the order endured long after the war's end. Could an army remain apolitical when fighting an ideological war? Could obedience coexist with conscience in a regime built on total control? The answers, drawn from millions of corpses buried across the Eastern Front, were unambiguous. The Commissar order had demonstrated how ideology could transform soldiers into executioners, not by coercion, but by conviction. By the time the last trials concluded and the Cold War divided Europe once again, the document that began with Hitler's signature had become a warning to future generations. It revealed how the machinery of modern warfare could be fused with political extremism to produce systematic evil. The Commissar order was not merely a command, it was a template for moral collapse. Its words, preserved in archives and testimonies, remain a reminder that obedience without humanity is not discipline, it is complicity, and the price of such obedience was measured not in victories, but in graves stretching from Smolensk to Berlin. The aftermath of the Commissar order extended far beyond the courtrooms of Nuremberg. It became a lasting wound on the conscience of post-war Europe, a moral fault line dividing the memory of the war from the reality of its conduct. For the German officer corps, the reckoning was not only legal but existential. Many who had risen through the ranks of the Wehrmacht during the Eastern Campaign now faced the realization that their honor had been inseparable from atrocity. The bureaucratic precision with which the Commissar order had been implemented forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their complicity had not been the product of chaos, but of order itself. Within West Germany, the reconstruction of national identity required selective amnesia. The emerging narrative of the Cold War, in which the Soviet Union became the new adversary, encouraged Western governments to downplay crimes committed on the Eastern Front. Former officers who had enforced or tolerated the Commissar order were quietly reintegrated into the Bundeswehr and the new intelligence services. By 1955, more than 12,000 former Wehrmacht and SS officers had returned to state service in some form. Few spoke openly of ideological directives or mass executions. In the Soviet Union, stories of hero commissars who died defying German executioners became central to wartime propaganda and post-war education. Monuments in Moscow, Minsk, and Volgograd commemorated these figures as symbols of ideological purity. Soviet textbooks described the order as the ultimate expression of fascist inhumanity, contrasting it with the moral righteousness of the Red Army. Yet this narrative also served to conceal the brutality of Stalin's own system, which had condemned thousands of its own soldiers as traitors for being captured. In a grim irony, while one side executed commissars for being symbols of Bolshevism, the other imprisoned them for failing to die in its defense. By the 1970s, the Commissar order had become a focal point of ethical debate in military academies and universities across Europe. The central question was no longer who had issued or obeyed it, but why so few had refused. Records from Wehrmacht courts-martial show that only a handful of officers attempted to resist or reinterpret the directive. Most chose silence or compliance. Even those who privately doubted its legality continued to apply it, rationalizing that personal dissent would change nothing. This phenomenon, moral paralysis in the face of criminal command, became a subject of psychological study. Scholars such as Stanley Milgram and Hannah Arendt drew direct parallels between the order and the mechanisms of obedience in authoritarian systems, illustrating how ordinary individuals could become agents of atrocity without perceiving themselves as such. The physical evidence of the order's legacy lay buried across Eastern Europe. Mass graves discovered in Smolensk, Bryansk, and Kharkiv throughout the 1970s and 1980s contained the remains of political officers and civilians executed during the early months of the invasion. In many cases, Soviet forensic teams identified victims through fragments of uniform insignia or Commissar badges, silent proof of how systematically the directive had been carried out. Each exhumation reaffirmed the scale of the crime and the intimacy of its execution. These were not anonymous deaths caused by artillery or bombing. They were deliberate, personal killings carried out face to face, often within minutes of capture. In Germany, a generational shift finally began to dismantle the wall of silence. The publication of photographs and letters in exhibitions such as The Crimes of the Wehrmacht, 1995-2004, confronted the public with irrefutable evidence of ordinary soldiers participating in executions. Veterans associations protested fiercely, accusing historians of defaming the army, but the impact was irreversible. The younger generation demanded accountability not only from individuals, but from institutions, schools, museums, and the military itself. The Bundeswehr incorporated the Commissar order into its ethical training, framing it as a lesson in the limits of obedience. The phrase innere Führung, or leadership through conscience, became a cornerstone of its doctrine, a deliberate inversion of the blind obedience that had once defined the Wehrmacht. Internationally, the order reshaped the legal concept of command responsibility. The Nuremberg precedent established that obedience to superior orders could no longer serve as a full defense against war crimes. Later tribunals, from My Lai to Srebrenica, invoked its logic, emphasizing that soldiers must refuse unlawful commands, even under threat. In this sense, the Commissar order achieved a paradoxical legacy. Its horror became the foundation for modern military ethics. What had once been the language of annihilation now stood as the measure of moral judgment. Yet even into the 21st century, the debate over culpability continues. Some German historians argue that the order reflected the totalitarian nature of the Nazi regime rather than the inherent character of the Wehrmacht, while others see it as evidence that ideology had penetrated every level of command. Survivors' testimonies from both sides still carry the weight of that moral ambiguity. Former soldiers recall moments of hesitation and rationalization, while Soviet veterans describe the terror of knowing that surrender meant death. Their memories converge on a single truth: the Commissar order stripped the war of its last vestige of humanity. What remains most haunting about the order is its simplicity. It required no machinery of extermination, no vast bureaucracy, no concentration camps. It relied only on obedience, on men willing to believe that ideology could define who deserved to live. And in that belief, the war on the Eastern Front ceased to be a conflict between armies. It confirmed the Soviet self-image of moral superiority, presenting the Red Army not merely as a military force, but as a defender of civilization itself. School textbooks described commissars facing firing squads with unbroken conviction, their deaths sanctified as acts of collective resistance. Monuments and films immortalized their courage, often merging fact with legend. Yet behind the propaganda lay a grim irony. The same Soviet system that exalted commissars as heroes continued to persecute returning POWs as traitors, sending thousands to Gulag camps. Thus, the legacy of the order served two opposing purposes: external moral condemnation and internal control. In the West, the order's significance evolved differently. For early Cold War audiences, the Commissar order was folded into the broader narrative of Nazi aggression and totalitarian excess. It was studied as a symptom of Hitler's ideology rather than an indictment of the Wehrmacht's professional culture,